Fancy.
Hello and welcome to our Women in Leadership webinar, How MBAs Can Contribute to a More Gender Balanced Boardroom. MBA programs are key in bringing women into leadership positions, and we know that more women in leadership positions should lead to more women on boards. And I'm very excited to be here with my two guests. Before I ask you to introduce yourselves, I just want to say a warm welcome to everyone who's connecting online with us today from all over the world, really, and from our whole MBA community, whether that's the Global MBA, the Executive MBA, students, alumni, candidates, and just friends in our community. So thanks so much for being with us. We will have a short discussion on the panel and then, of course, open it up to questions and answers for everyone in the virtual room. And you'll see at the bottom right of your screens a small icon for questions. As we go through, if you have questions, feel free to add them in there at any time. It won't be interrupting us, and we'll stop from time to time to check in on your questions. And we'll also leave some time at the end of the webinar to go over your questions. So don't be shy. We love your questions, and we'll be very happy to answer them. There's also a chat box as well. If you want to express yourselves or want to encourage us or encourage each other in any way, feel free to use that too. And I think that's it. We should get started. So I'd like to thank you so much, Jane Hoskison and Will Novak, for being with us today. You're both graduates of EDHEC Global MBA and from different generations. So that's really interesting. I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself. So we can start with you, Jane. Go ahead, and then you can pass it on to Will after that.
Yeah, for fear of giving my age away, I did graduate 20 years ago from my MBA, but it feels like yesterday, so if that counts for anything. I am the Director of Talent, Learning, Engagement and Diversity at IATA, which is the International Air Transport Association, and we represent over 300 airlines around the world and do a lot of advocacy work for them and set standards. So every time that you get on a plane, you know that you will be safe.
Wonderful.
So I am Will Novak. I graduated just last year, actually. So yay, congratulations to me. And my background is actually in the legal nonprofit sector. I worked in access to justice and criminal law for about 12 years before I went to do my MBA, without dating myself as well. And now I work as a foresight consultant at Warbeck Hager in Berlin.
Thank you, and welcome to both of you. And let me say, with a little bit of a delay, Happy International Women's Day to both of you and to all of our listeners online. I think yesterday was a big day. It's fantastic to see just how much more communication goes out around this day now in the corporate environment, and I think that's already a great sign for women in leadership, that it's actually a very broad topic and seems to be quite popular on the social media. So that's a real victory right there. But so that leads me to my first question, which is rather general. But so why is the topic of today's webinar important to you personally? And I'll let either one of you start. Maybe Will, go ahead and start with this one.
For me, it's really important for a couple of reasons. It's personally, I have this beautiful niece, and I just think about her and her potential and where she could go in the world, and I just think that she's born to be a leader, and so it's so important that we keep moving this forward and we keep making leaps and bounds in this area. But also, in terms of professionally, I've worked for so many organizations where women are undervalued and oftentimes, can end up being a lot more competent than men at the top. So the idea of having an MBA and the doors that it opens for you allows you to then enter into this space. It just sort of gives you an additional layer of credibility and respect. And so this is why this is an important thing for me.
Yeah, I think I agree with Will a little bit. It's kind of like your personal experience drives why you get interested. I just thinking back to International Women's Day, Sandra, when I first came to IATA, it wasn't so big in the UK like 10 years ago. And the very first day, somebody said, why don't we give all the women flowers for International Women's Day? And I think that was the moment that I thought, I think I need to change some things around what we think International Women's Day should be about, because it's not about platitudes. It's about saying there's still a lot of work to do. And I suppose that probably was when my interest kind of started to become around, oh, yeah, actually, I do see that it's different for women. I see that it's different for my female colleagues who've had children, who've taken a pause, these fantastic women who've got so much to contribute. And then people were literally saying, well, you're going to have babies. Well, that doesn't mean that I can't contribute. It means that I have a different perspective, and actually I can juggle a lot more and I can do different things. And so that fed into then looking around the aviation industry. So I came from oil and gas, which is notoriously male dominated, but BP were fantastically good at putting in place programs. I went to IATA and I thought, this is going to be a really diverse place. And it was like men. Every CEO I looked at was a man. And that's kind of why we started one of the initiatives that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, which is we simply have to get more diversity into the senior levels of aviation, because we need it for safety, we need it for products, we need it for services. And so, it's not just like because it's the right thing to do. It's like a business imperative to do it. And so that's kind of where my interest kind of came. But maybe it was the flowers that were the real starting point for my interest. And that's why, I can buy myself flowers, as the song goes.
That's a good point. But interestingly, higher education has made incredible progress in the last 10 years of bringing women up into the leadership positions. And recently we were in an accreditation meeting here at EDHEC, and these are events that happen every 5 years. In the 5 years since the last accreditation, we could physically see in the room the greater number of women in leadership in higher education. It was fantastic. And so you really are starting to see the change. And I think, to round out what you've both said, this is something that's incredibly inspiring to me, and I think to all of us. So thank you for sharing that as well. I guess that having been in the business for quite a long time in different industries, because both of you've been in very different types of industries. What have you seen out in the field as the biggest obstacles to women reaching the C-suite or reaching the boardroom or executive positions?
I'm happy to start on that one if you'd like. So for me, coming from the legal sector, especially in criminal law, this is a very highly male-dominated field. There's a stigma that it takes a certain kind of person to be successful, to win cases, that sort of thing. And so really what I see is that the issue is systemic, because it seems like it's sort of a bit of an old boys club, and people want to hire people that remind them of themselves. And so there's nothing in place a lot of times to have them question that or think outside of the box and look more at the skills that somebody brings to the role, what's sort of missing, and the ways that they can fill the gaps in a really meaningful way. And then, which kind of leads to the second reason that's sort of systemic as well. Because of this, you just don't see women in leadership roles, especially in those industries. And so it's hard for you to imagine even getting there, because you're like, well, no one's ever done it before. How do I break that glass ceiling? It's just exceedingly complicated and difficult to imagine yourself getting there. So you kind of, a lot of times, what I've noticed that women will self-select out, especially in the legal field. They'll just sort of say, okay, I'll go to nonprofit. I'll go to a different way. And I think that's the real problem, is that there's this lack of, I don't know, the thread doesn't tie together somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I think Stephanie's point is really important, and it's a phrase that we use a lot. you can't be what you can't see. And I think think about the last plane journey that you made, and I'm going to go back to aviation because it's so visible for so many of us, that, actually you get on a plane, you see the cabin crew and you hear the pilot, and invariably you hear a male voice. Now, if you're flying from a very small age, you hear a male voice and you think pilot or captain, and and so I think this whole idea that you've got to see it, to be it, to believe that you can do it. But I think, and Stephanie's talking about the kind of at the organizational level, I think there's also structural things in a community level as well. So there's lots of government initiatives that don't go far enough in encouraging girls into STEM subjects, but not just encouraging them in the education piece when they come out the other side. And I'm going to use Switzerland as a great example. Switzerland still is one of the countries, I mean, they've just released, the Economist released the gender glass ceiling index recently, and Switzerland was languishing down at the bottom. I think it was 27th. And it's really easy to understand why. Because there's not childcare provisions for women to easily go back to work. So I think you have to marry these two things together, and they're really, really important. It's like, what are you doing at an organizational level so it's not a boys' club, so that when you recruit, you're recruiting the right people, that you've got the right culture in place, you've got the right policies in place, you've got the right practices. But what government's doing as well to equal that balance in a meaningful way, other than saying, yay, we think equality is really important and we've got a law that says women can't be discriminated against. Well, that's great. That's just like a hygiene factor, right? But if you haven't got, school places, if you haven't got provision for, and it's not just school care, it's, parental leave, it's caring on the other side too. We often think of children, but what about the sandwich generation who've got kids and elderly parents to care about? What gives on those things? So I think it's like this massive, big issue. I wish there was one magic thing that you could pull the trigger on and go, that's fixing it. But it's like pay, it's, it's a whole bunch of structural things as well that they're in countries as well as organizations.
Yeah, so true. And then it does become a little overwhelming, doesn't it? But it's true that research shows that countries which have the infrastructure around families and women and healthcare, et cetera, tend to have a smaller pay gap and a higher equity in the workplace than you'll find in countries that do not. And it's not a question of emerging markets versus industrialized markets, not at all, in fact.
No, it really isn't.
It's really a good question to ask, perhaps when you decide where you want to work as a woman, something to think about, maybe there should be a global index around that. But so today we'd like to focus in a little bit more, because of course, we would have a very long webinar in our hands if we tried to solve all those problems. So what we
try though.
We have about a half an hour now to really explore what educators can do to help women reach executive levels in their careers. Now, I know you already mentioned, I would say at the level of school children and getting more women into STEM from a very early age. Here in higher education and in postgraduate education, of course, we are tributary to that. So we're already starting with a population of women where there are fewer women coming from STEM and fewer women coming from sciences, et cetera. So what would you say beyond I would say the primary level of education, would you say that educators can do to help women reach executive levels in their careers?
Yeah, Will, do you want to?
As you wish, madam. Yeah, I mean, for me, gosh, there's so much, but I think the thing that when I think about it, it boils down to it personally is that it's about teaching men. It's about teaching men to place value on different leadership styles and to change their way of thinking around it, because that's how, for me, that's one of the ways to make a big change, is to change the way that they're doing things, because they're the ones who are at the top. They are able to get into those positions, and they're the ones who can make the actual change. So really that aspect of making sure that they're put in a place where they, feel like they understand and they really can value and see what it brings to having a more diverse, not just women, but, people of color, people from different backgrounds and cultures, all of that, the importance and the richness that brings to a company in every way. I think that's one of the most important things, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's very true that equity and diversity for women at work goes hand in hand with equity and diversity for minorities, for other types of diversity that you have in a workplace. And that if you have programs for diversity in general, that almost always benefits women.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we always say that it's one of the programs that I run focuses on gender, and and I think that that's one of its strengths, and at the same time one of its weaknesses, because it's focused on gender. Gender is a door opener, but you have to kind of make sure that you keep the door open for everything else as well. You can't be kind of exclusive. I think that I was just thinking back to what was it that made me pick the MBA that I chose in the first place when I chose it. And actually, kind of, this probably sounds like a crazy thing, but I'd still love to go back and do another one. I would do another
You're
MBA.
welcome to come back, Jane.
But that's probably because it was a long time ago and I've forgotten the horror of it. But it's kind of like, I mean, it wasn't horrible, it was great, but it was hard work. And, a lot of that, what attracted me most was, it was a far more, and I use this word very carefully, it was a far less masculine MBA than other MBAs.
Mm-hmm.
It were, and I think that's one of the things that I noticed through EDHEC is, in particular, is there are some business schools that are quite atypical and quite alpha in the curriculum that they put together. And I think that is something that is, really, really important, is like, how do you appeal to the fact that, I want to be a successful leader, but I don't want to become an alpha male in order to become a successful leader. And these traditional characteristics of what success looks like, I think is really important. And that's, I have to really give credit to EDHEC, because my feeling is that you've been really, really good at evolving it so that it's very balanced in what is important in the curriculum. I don't know, Will, if you feel the same thing.
100%. I agree. That was also one of the things that attracted me to this particular MBA, was just the fact that it looked at so many different things and different aspects, not just the academics and, you have to learn finance and all that stuff. It was such a, like, it was just such a I did learn finance. It's true. It was not fun, but I did it. But it was a well-rounded education. Just looked at it from all different aspects. And I thought, and that's exactly right. That was one of the reasons I chose it. So.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at what are the ultimate skills that we're going to need in the future, and the World Economic Forum is fantastic at publishing data around this, and this idea that we're going to have to, I think their last World of Work report was 2020, like, your skills are going to have to be refreshed in 5 years' time, so those skills that we thought were really important in 2020, well, we're having a debate at work about, what are we going to do about ChatGPT? Because there's a whole bunch of legal skills, for example, that some of the new generations are just completely obliterating the need for basic level legal skills, which is what lawyers did to kind of, cut their teeth. It's going to be the same for comms people. What does that mean for comms people? What does it mean for advocates? So there's a whole bunch of that conversation is getting really accelerated. And I kind of think, in complementary to these very hard science skills, the critical success factors will be about those softer skills. And how do you train for them? How do you teach them? And I think Will made a really good point earlier that, it's really about kind of getting this balance and educating men as much as women, because, and you've got to bring everybody to the party when you're looking at creating a diverse workforce. You can't just bring the people that class themselves as diverse into that conversation, because you automatically create a group who feels like, well, I don't fit any of those characteristics and I feel oppressed. You know, and that's kind of an important dialogue to be having, I think.
Definitely. One of the things that I find really exciting about the educational experience in an MBA particularly is that we have a lot of intense teamwork in the MBA and group work to achieve challenging goals. And we force the diversity in these teams, you know, which is not always easy for the participants, of course. But for the first time, some people are working with diverse teams and gender balanced teams. And there's no hierarchy in those teams. Everybody's a CEO. And I think that this is a great leveler, an incredible experience. And it teaches everyone in the room that different doesn't mean worse or better.
Great.
So maybe try and ask you to go back a little bit in time to your MBA and remember some of the courses that you took and you know how they might have impacted you. And both of you in leadership have been in leadership roles, sometimes before the MBA and now after the MBA. And do you remember which courses that you took during the MBA that are now having an impact on your role as leaders?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, look, the most profound one for me, and this is a graduation night story, was I hadn't thought about HR as a career, and I did the HR classes and I could not get enough of it. I just gobbled it up. I was just, wow, this is really interesting. How do you use a human element to really kind of drive better performance? And I remember the dean at the time said to me over dinner that night when we graduated, he said, "You will have a career in HR. Don't get there too fast. Make sure that you see other parts of the business beforehand." And it was like a really kind of, it just gives me goosebumps remembering that conversation, because he was so right. He was absolutely right. Of course, I ended up in HR. I couldn't help myself, because I love it, but I also took the time to get experiences in other areas, and sometimes very bizarre areas. I mean, I think I might have shared this story before, that I chose to become an auditor for 2 years. Now, I am probably the worst auditor ever, because it requires an attention to detail that just is not my style. But goodness me, I got the stories out of everybody. I got the real things that we were looking for, because it just chatted to people in a different way than an auditor asking their questions. So that kind of like balance, I would say HR got me there. But I think the other thing was we had a strong focus on innovation. And I look back at all the mini projects that we did. I remember a couple of things that we did as projects. One was, what if you used your phone as a dating app? And remember, this is when we all had Nokia bricks. So, pilot. So it wasn't like, it was like, wow, that was a long time ago.
So I remember those days, don't you worry.
But and it was kind of like, wow, that would be a really cool idea. And here we are, like many years later with that. And then the other thing was a project that we did for our consulting projects, where we were looking at how could you get medical information on a home device, that could feed to your doctor. And it's like, oh my God, now we all walk around with Apple Watches that are telling us our heart rate, and is my heartbeat going in the right way? And, and so that, I think that curiosity for technology was something that was really ignited in me that I'd never really thought of before. And even now I'm super excited by the application of technology from the MBA course.
That's really interesting, because it's so funny. It's kind of the same thing for me. It's like all those courses that just sort of I had never touched on, or I never would have imagined being what inspired me. So, again, back with the finance, like I never would have thought that I could enjoy corporate finance, but then going through the course, it was hard, but like that was such a great course for me to get an understanding of how the world works, and pulling it all together in the strategy course. That's really what did it for me. I knew this was something that I wanted to kind of start getting into and learning about. And really, I think those courses, the ones that you're most scared of, are the ones that build your confidence the most. And so those are the ones that really affect you. and they change you as a person, because you become stronger and you can now apply this knowledge in different ways and in your style, in a way that works for you, the way you did, Jane, by deciding to be an auditor randomly, right? And I think, yeah, those are the most impactful ones. The ones that were the hardest were the ones that made the biggest difference.
Yeah, this is fantastic to hear, and it's true that self-confidence is often an issue for women leaders, and for women to step up into leadership is feeling ready for that, and we may take more time to feel ready as women, and I think that when you get through an MBA, you kind of feel like, if I got through that, I can go through anything. I can get through anything, and also it raises your comfort level. That today you probably wouldn't worry about having a conversation with the CFO, which in your job must be pretty frequent.
Yeah. And I'm not at all as worried. It's fine. I know what's happening, and then it ties in with the way that, my leadership style and the way that I communicate. So it's taking who you are and taking that knowledge and bringing them together.
Well said. Thank you for that. Jane, in your role, you help grow women leaders from inside the company, from inside your organization. How would you say that as a school, we should be best preparing the next generation of women leaders for organizations like yours?
Teach them to negotiate on salary. I mean, I have got another answer as well, but actually that is one thing that I think is incredible that still gets in the way for women when they come out of MBA school is, I see it because I spent a lot of time when I was working at BP recruiting graduates from MBA schools, and all of the gents would negotiate on their salary, even though it said it's a fixed salary. And all of the women wouldn't. And again, all like 99% of them wouldn't, and I kind of think that negotiation piece is really, really important, because it's not just negotiation on salary, it's negotiating for your rights and negotiating to stand your ground on stuff. And I think that skill helps bring confidence. So this idea of negotiating, whether it's for your salary, that's a very obvious one, but actually it's a bit deeper than that. In how do you negotiate a business case? How do you negotiate with adversarial colleagues who see it in one way and not the other, and managing that conflict and having the confidence to manage that conflict is actually probably more important than equipping them with the technical skills around finance and HR and accounting and your marketing and product development, because they're where I see that there's no difference necessarily in the grades that people get, but there is something about this ability to hold your ground. And I see there's a question that came up in the chat around kind of the space for female style leadership. I think that's so important to build the confidence that, and it was what I was alluding to earlier, you don't have to be a man to be successful, and you don't have to have masculine values to be successful. Some of the best leaders I know, some of the best male leaders I know, have very strong typically female attributed values. So it's kind of standing your ground on those things.
Wonderful. Any reaction to that, Stephanie? Sorry, Will. The other way.
We knew this was going to happen. This is my life. It's interesting because I saw that question come up and I was waiting to kind of get to it. And I completely agree because, earlier, Sandra, you mentioned the idea that nobody's a CEO in the groups, everyone's a CEO in your small groups. But in my small groups, that was not the case. I was the CEO. I ran those groups, and I did it in a very female leadership style. It was collaborative. It was communicative. We worked together. We supported each other. There was room for emotion. There was room for discussion, and it was extremely successful. My group did an amazing, we worked so well together. And I think that is important to bring into these higher level positions, because we are all human beings. You're not working with robots. And so being able to see people for who they are and allowing them to be their full selves at work just makes such a difference in their level of happiness. It really does. And that's how you keep people around. So that's how I would.
I mean, I think to Lucia's question, what is hard is if you're the only female leader. And I mean, even like I was saying, if you have more tendency to be a male leader with feminine values, it can feel lonely. And that's why you hear a lot women say, I feel really lonely. I feel lonely at the top because I either have to change my behavior to become more like the people that I'm surrounded with. And that causes massive stress and tension because you're compromising yourself. And I think that the McKinsey report that came out last year about women in the workplace and the work that they do with Lean In is like women are quitting at much higher levels, at senior levels than ever before. And I think it's got a lot to do with this idea that we've had to morph so much to get to the top with these masculine values. When we get there, we're exhausted. Mm-hmm. We're really tired, and we're like, and look, I'm surrounded by people who are just not getting it. And is it worth it? Because that tension will catch up with you eventually. So being your authentic self is really the most important lesson that you can learn, and not feeling that you've got to morph yourself into something that you're not. Because then when you get there, you'll be exhausted and fed up, and and people will look up to you and go, well, who are they? They're not an authentic leader, and that authentic leadership is so important.
That's a really, really important point. Thanks for sharing that, Jane. And when you look at it from an organizational point of view, because today where you sit in your organization, can you speak to the changes that organizations need to make to help women thrive and grow as leaders?
Yeah, Will, do you want to?
Nope, you can go right ahead, Jane.
I mean, as you know, Sandra, I'm leading an initiative for not just for IATA, but for actually the aviation industry itself. And we have 188 member airlines that have signed up. And that's everything from, the biggest airlines in the world to some of the smallest airlines. So you'll recognize a lot of the big names, and you might not recognize all of the small names. And, the thing that they've really got to focus on is, I think that really 3 pillars are very, very important for organizations. Culture. So what are you going to do to change the culture, or to ensure that the culture is open for everyone to be true to who they are and succeed without conforming? And culture change takes time, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it's really painful, but it's worth it. So what are you going to do around culture change? The second thing I think that is really important is monitoring and reporting. So how are you monitoring it? How are you reporting it on as many things as possible? It's not just like, how many women have we got in our leadership team? Are we paying people fairly? But there's, a lot of kind of things that you need to be able to kind of monitor and report on. And then I think the final thing is like policies and practices that support the cultural change and help you move your monitoring and reporting. So, and it can be anything from what's your policy on putting pictures on your website that represent your organization. So, if you type in the word captain into Google, you will find a gazillion pictures of white men and very few of anything else. And, there's 1 or 2 that will jump out as like first female that circumnavigated the globe solo, and these things. So you've got to be really careful. You've got to be super, super mindful and purposeful. And those 3, I think, for us are really where we focus the attention on: culture, monitoring, reporting, and measurement, and the policies and practices that you have.
Thanks for that. So Will and Jane, I'm going to switch to your back to your MBA experience and to your now to your graduated period. So to ask you about how your MBA education has today, has impacted your leadership posture in your role today.
I mean, it's so funny because like I think think for me, it sort of made me a little more adaptable. I've definitely become more confident and more straightforward. I think Sandra can probably attest to this. I used to beat around the bush a lot or take on most of the work if I needed to. I'm a bit of an overachiever. But in terms of the way I see it, I see now the value of having a little bit from column A, a little from column B, a little from column C, and using those tools where appropriate based on who I'm working with at the time. So I guess, I don't know if that entirely answers, but I like the smorgasbord approach personally.
Yeah. You know, one of the first people that I met when I sat down to my MBA was a guy called Declan, and he sat next to me, you know, like we were all allocated seats and he sat next to me. And I remember like very early on, we were having this conversation and we said, probably going to get more done if we collaborate, aren't we? Like probably going to get a lot more done if we can work together on this. Let's work together. And you know, I think that was probably the best lesson ever, is you really achieve more collaborating. And I think there was a bit of a mentality going very quickly into the MBA, it was a competition, not collaboration. Now, of course, that changes as you go through the year, but that's stuck with me completely. And this initiative that we're running for the airlines, we always say, whilst we compete on getting people in seats and onto routes, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, collaboration is the only way we're going to make a change. And so I think that that's probably that was the thing that I got from the soft side, and that shaped my kind of leadership style that I have now, more than anything else.
Yeah, I think the soft skill element of the MBA is something that we can hear from many employers today. Going back to your comments also about technology, but then back to what you just said, that leadership is absolutely something that employers are looking for from MBA graduates. Are there other skills you'd like to add now that you've sort of both heard your version?
You know, I've always just been very empathic, and I think that's something that I'm going to stick with forever. I think for me, I think that's really effective. And I feel like the MBA almost allowed me to double down on my style in a sense, in a way. It really just affirmed for me that I like the way I am, and I like leading this way. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important part of it, isn't it? That kind of like giving you space to develop your leadership style, whatever that looks like. I think the other side of it is this curiosity around that bigger picture thinking. And I know, you know, the only way I can compare is people that are maybe at, you know, that I work with that haven't gone through an MBA. I think that it gives you the ability to join very disparate and random dots on a horizon that perhaps others don't see, because you're looking for patterns. So you're looking for patterns between what you might think of going on in the economy and what you might see happening in an operational basis. And it helps you, you know, when you're kind of reading through the newspapers, okay, well, what's going on in that particular organization against an economic backdrop, against a financial backdrop, against a cultural backdrop. And I think that is the difference, is the ability to connect seemingly disparate dots. And that's what the MBA really hones, you know. And I think that, you know, if you look at, you know, again, it's just my own reflection of, if I look at the collection of books that I read and the sources of inspiration prior to the MBA and post the MBA, they're really, really different.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's inspiring. Now, you come from quite different MBA generations, and you kind of had very different MBAs. The MBAs evolved a lot over time. But looking back to your time with the MBA, what would you have liked to see in your MBA that you think would have helped you in your growth towards leadership?
So For me, I think I would have liked to see, I mean, you see it in practice when you're working with people from all over the world and the different styles. But I think culture, there's something to say about a culture where somebody comes from and the leadership styles that are valued there. And I think it would have been nice to get a better understanding of, what is the leadership culture in Japan, for example, or in India, and really getting that information up front so you can better understand the people that you're working with. I think that would have been something that that would have really added for me in that area. Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were lucky that we got quite a lot of exposure to non-traditional kind of career thinking. We had quite a few people that went and did startups when they finished our MBA. I mean, I think we had quite a high percentage of people that went into creating their own businesses or doing some kind of startups. And I remember that being kind of really, wow, I always thought it was like corporate. And didn't feel sure about where I would go. I think the kind of career advice, and that's where I think, Sandra, you do a great job in what I've seen you do over the last couple of years. EDHEC is really giving that exposure to non-traditional careers as well as traditional careers. But I think, broadening people's minds that career paths now are really, really different. And I think having that confidence to build your own career path in a way that suits you would have been helpful, but it was 20 years ago. So, I guess that's come to me over time. But I think that would have been more helpful to think about non-traditional careers. Like I said, though, the professor, the dean at the time gave me the best advice ever. So, I was lucky, because he told me to think differently about how I would manage my career.
Thank you for that. We have a question that's come through, so I'm going to take this pose to kind of draw your attention to it. It's from Brigitte, and you can have a read. And the questions around, first of all, thanks for the motivating conversations, and I join you, Brigitte, on that. And the question: how did you find the right organization for work which is suited for you? Can you give me some advice?
I found plenty of wrong ones that weren't suited for me.
Trial and error, then.
Gosh, I think it comes back to your values. What am I willing to work in? And I started my career working for a tobacco company, and I wouldn't go back and do that now, but I was, a student. I just finished university, and it was a fantastic job at that point in time. And it's not a choice I would make now, because it wouldn't align with my values of what I think is important. Now, there's probably some people that would go, well, hold on, tobacco, oil and gas, and aviation can't think that you're a very good environmentalist. And, and I think that's a kind of, that's probably a criticism that when I look at that, but I believe that aviation is in a really good place to connect the world, and connectivity is really important to me. That aligns with my values. I think the advice that I would have for you, Brigitte, is to look at really what matters with you and align with that, rather than think, oh gosh, I've just got my MBA, or I've just gone into this and I need to align with kudos companies that fit the mold of working post MBA, because there's a lot of people that go into these really big organizations and they just spit them out at the end, and it's not fulfilling and it burns a lot of time, and because it's not right for you. The only other advice that I would give you is, if you find yourself in an organization that doesn't fit your values, get out of there as quickly as possible.
Oh my gosh, the value of having or knowing what you don't like is sometimes better than knowing what you do, right?
Yeah.
I just know I would never work in a big company, a big it just doesn't work for me. And I know that because I tried it. So I think, when you're deciding, just also bear in mind, in addition to what Jane said, which is great advice, bear in mind that this is not the rest of your life. Right? This is for now. And for now, this might work for you. And then, you know what? In a year, you can reevaluate. In 2 years, you can reevaluate. And you can think, is this role right for me? Am I the best person for this role anymore? Maybe you're tired and you're not inspired to do this work anymore. So really thinking about your life not as a be-all, end-all decision. This is just one step on the way to who you're going to be.
Do you know, Will, that comment's prompted in me an answer to Sandra's question from before of what would you have liked more of from your MBA? And this is very personal. It's just personal for me because it's something that I learned quite quickly after my MBA, but not quickly enough. And that's actually financial independence. So, you know, we come out of the MBA and depending on how you funded it, you know, most people have got some financial commitment that they've got to honor as a result of that MBA investment, either whether it's to a company or whether it's to a loan or whether it's to some, you know, they've sacrificed some money. There's been an opportunity cost of doing the MBA. Apart from, there was one girl in our class who invested in the stock market and she made 3 times the amount of the MBA, but she was a genius in the stock market. But actually your own personal financial independence, because I think to what Will said is really important. Sometimes, and we do this a lot as women naturally will have less financial stability than men in the longer term for a whole bunch of reasons. And that could be because they go out of work for a period of time, because they have childcare, because they have, you know, they take a break in their career, and that has an impact not just on the money that they're earning now, but their pensions and what they invest in. And so when you said that, Will, I was like, you know what? I think I would have loved a financial independence course that helped me better understand that investing, how important investing for the future was, because we do great corporate finance stuff, but actually your independent financial security is really, really important too, because it gives you the freedom to say, this job sucks and I can take 6 months off before I need to find another job.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for all that good advice. I know what I need to do with the curriculum soon.
Don't ask me to give you advice on, you know, where to get teachers for it, because it's like a hard.
That's the question, right? And then I need everyone to sign a disclaimer, you know, if you don't make money doing it.
Oh God, it sounds so boring though as a recommendation. It's like, wow, financial independence, really dull. But you know, financial independence gives you the best freedom of all.
This is true, and you're so right that as women we tend to push that aside to other priorities, and the time you need to think about that is just about the same time you would start an MBA in your 30s, right? Your late 20s, 30s, really the best time to start thinking about your financial independence. So absolutely valuable advice. Thank you for that. I want to draw your attention to a wonderful question in the chat from Julian. And the question is, how would you have liked to seen the men better support the women in your respective MBA cohorts? Great question for you.
Oh, Julian.
Julian is a classmate of
yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm happy to go. Just you know, when I was doing my MBA, I was slightly involved in the extracurriculars, just a little bit. And yeah, overachiever, maybe a little bit. But one of my roles was the president of the Diversity and Social Impact Club. And I think for me, one of the most disheartening things about being in that role was how few men ever engaged in any of the activities that were being done, particularly around issues of gender. And I think that is just so disappointing. And I think that to have them there and to signal their support, that they're, you know, they don't have to necessarily be super participative, but just to show that they know that this is an issue, I think that would have made such a difference.
Yeah, I wonder, Will, if we sometimes forget to ask the question of, how do you feel when we talk about diversity and inclusion? Because I suspect we've just done a staff survey, and one of the comments is about this thing that I feel excluded because I am in this demographic of, you know, I'm kind of European, I'm male, I'm, in my kind of 50s. And how do we then embrace everybody? Because quite often I hear men say, yeah, but it's not my problem. It's not my problem. That's something that you're dealing with. And it's like, so actually I wouldn't, and I struggle with this a lot. How do we reframe the question differently? And how do we make it less about this is something we're struggling with and we want you to help us, to actually make it a joined up conversation between men and women, to address the kind of gender aspect. I think, this is where allyship is so important. And, the one thing that men can do is around not being a bystander to microaggressions that get in the way of anybody with a diverse background being included in the conversation. So I saw yesterday we invited a fantastic CEO to do a talk for us on International Women's Day, and he used a sentence and it just made me so happy. He said, "That's a fantastic idea. Could I add a perspective onto that idea?" Right. And that sounds like a really, well, yeah, what's so great about that sentence? But how often do you hear that? How often do you hear something that sounds like, dismiss your idea and I'm going to give my own spin on it and I'm going to make it sound like my own idea? And, and I just thought to myself, he's very sophisticated in the way that he builds that conversation, taking an idea and building rather than discounting and representing, which often happens.
Thank you. Those are good answers to that tough question. We're going to have to wrap up on time, so I encourage anyone who has a last question to put that in the question box. Jane, my last question is for you, and perhaps, Will, you can also talk a little bit about your experience of this course. 2 years ago, we introduced a course on diversity and inclusion for the first time, and this year, Jane, you led this session. And I wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about your teaching experience, what you learned, because I know that teaching, you learn a lot actually in the classroom, and what's your impression of the new generation of leaders coming out of the MBA. And my original question was women leaders coming out of the MBA, but actually, based on what you just said, I'd like that to open that up and say the new generation of women and men leaders, of all leaders coming out of the MBA.
So the first thing was, in some ways it was like terrifying, because I was just thinking, oh my goodness, like this is really important. I want people to be inspired by that. And that puts a lot of pressure on you, because it's not a topic that, many MBAs are kind of talking about. They're like, well, give me the finance module and so I think that, from that point of view, it was really, really interesting to engage in the conversations. And I think that, there was a lot more openness to the conversation with the MBA students than perhaps we see in the workplace. That was something that was kind of really, really, I really appreciated, was the questioning and the kind of perspective, and, this idea of, oh gosh, sometimes I haven't encountered that, because we have to remember that there's some things that happen in workplaces that I think are dying out, that they will die out eventually. Those kind of like very patriarchal styles will die out, and the new generation hopefully won't have to put up with them. I mean, as always, as you said, it's like you learn just as much, I hope, as the students around different perspectives and how to engage in the conversation in a meaningful way, and how to, bring it back to their reality, which is different to mine. Everybody's reality is slightly different. So that was something that trying to flex to that and make sure that I wasn't, bringing my own perspectives of, I'm different generation to that generation. But the thing most of all was, I was like, God, I want to be back in their seats again. I want to be back learning. And so the thing that really inspired me is whilst I look after learning and development, I kind of lost I haven't learned something, but I've lost my passion for learning. And so it reignited a passion to want to learn in me. So it was fantastic from that point of view.
Yeah, the feedback from the students was also fantastic. So thank you again for being there. And Will, you experienced the course with which was moderated by Robert Baker, who's our expert in residence around diversity and inclusion, who Jane has met as well. So I don't know if you want to give us your impressions of that course, and if you want to share anything about it.
I think it was, having it done by Robert, he's just brilliant and such a great ally when it comes to this issue. And he has so much experience working with people from all backgrounds and levels. And I think there was something about having just I don't want to say the image of it, but the fact that it is a man teaching this course also does have an impact on things, right? So to say that he's sort of taking that responsibility onto himself to make a difference in this area. And so, I thought that was, he was amazing. The class was great. I loved it. Obviously, it was one of my favorite classes. Shocking, but the conversations that we had, I think, were really, really important. So.
Yeah, I think, Will, it's a really good point that diversity and inclusion is better taught when it's taught with a range of people who bring different perspectives. I think, I think that's great when you see real allyship. And I agree with you, Robert's a real expert in this area.
So next year's course, we're hoping to put Rob and Jane together.
That's a great idea.
Scoop for anyone on the call. So we are nearly at the end of our time. Last chance for a question, I'm saying to those online. And I always like to give a last word to my panelists. So I'm going to I will babble on for a second to give you some time to think. I want to hear, if you have one last piece of advice for the listeners on the call, to help them and help us also help achieve the goal of more women in leadership, what would that advice be?
I mean, I think we talked about massive things like government, education, all of those things, but inclusion is the choice you make every single time of every day that you are interacting with someone. And it's the little choices that really make the difference.
Yeah. And I would also add to just trust yourself. So often a lot of leaders, everywhere, men, women, wherever, they don't believe in themselves, but really just trust that your gut instincts, that you know what's right and wrong and how you can push the dial forward in a way that works for you as well. Just be you. You
be you. Sounds like a good conclusion to me. Thank you so much. For those on the call, and if you want to revisit this discussion, which was really fantastic, and I want to thank Jane and Will for some fabulous insights into your MBA experience and into your experience in the workplace, and also your motivation, inspiration, encouragement for everyone on the call, whether they're men or women, to make the workplace a more equal place. And this webinar is going to be available on demand on the EDHEC Global MBA website anytime you want to re-see it. And I'm sure that if you have questions that come up after, you can reach out to us and we will be able to get in touch with Will or Jane to get an answer to you. So thanks so much for being with us. Warm thanks to you all. Again, happy International Women's Day, even though it's a day after, but we'll keep celebrating every other day of the year. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.